Well, last time we met, we looked at briefly just a small section of Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, and we used that as a springboard to get us back to Genesis. So right now what we're going to do is take a look in more detail at the creation account in Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. And so we springboard back. And we're going to determine one thing. This is our goal. Why are we here? It's one thing. And it's at the end of this segment in chapter 2, verse 2. It says, "By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day." God rested. We're asking the question, what does that mean? Again in the next verse, he rested from all his work. Okay? So that's where we're moving towards, and we're going to use the first chapter to try and answer that question, and a little bit of extra biblical help along the way, because it's hard for us in our culture to unpack something that maybe went without being said in another culture that we don't understand. So we'll get to that in just a minute. 1:1. So when we approach the creation account, I also want to acknowledge that there's many different ways that people approach this and understand creation. Okay, my purpose tonight is not to get into those debates. Those are great debates to have. It's just not the one that we're trying to get to. We're trying to get to what is rest in the seventh day. And I'm going to propose to you that when we approach this story of creation, any number of ways it could be interpreted, but overall, everybody I think agrees, or could agree, that it's generally understood as a process of taking something from a chaotic state, a disordered state, and putting it in a functional order. No matter what view you hold on how to interpret it, I think you can see that process. And we're going to just briefly, I'm not going to pack the whole chapter, but I'm going to just highlight what I mean by that. So, what does it mean? We can take a look at the first verse 2. The earth. What was it like in the beginning? It was formless and void. Formless. I'm not even quite sure what formless means. Void seems to be nothing, but there's something there because the earth is formless and void. So there's earth there, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. We know that earth was there, but water seemed to be covering everything, because later in this, he separates the water and dry land appears, right? So I want to propose to you that it's a non-functional system at the beginning. And what we see over the process of creation is God putting the non-functional chaos into an order and giving it a function so it will work. And it will house, ultimately, humans. Okay? But how does that look? And this is going to go very quick, and it's quite simplistic, so I apologize if you want me to try and expound on things that I'm not going to. But verses 3 through 31 of chapter 1 kind of explain the process of God giving order to the world. What does order look like? I'm going to define order as giving everything a place to be. Okay, that's very simplistic, but what does it look like in this chapter? Well, God says light, you go there. Darkness, you go there. It's even kind of hard, light. How did you put light? But that's kind of how the wording is, right? He separates light from darkness. Okay. Water, you go here. Land, you're there. Sky, you're up there. Okay. Luminaries, you're up in the sky. You got a place to be. Everything has a place to be. You see that? He's taking chaos, he's giving it order. And then he gives everything a function. Land. We know where you are now because I gave you the place to be. I'm going to give you something to do. You grow stuff. Okay? You grow stuff. And animals are going to be crawling around on you. Okay? Your job. It's your thing to do. Waters. You're going to hold swarms of living creatures. And you're also going to be used to water vegetation so it will grow. Water, that's your thing to do. Okay? Luminaries. You're going to be rotating so that there are days and seasons and years and things will grow and life will flourish. God's giving things a place to be and something to do. Yeah? Okay, so we get to day 6, and then animals are created, and they're supposed to multiply. But then humans, okay, humans are created, given a place to be, given a thing to do. What is it that humans are given to do? Well, there's in 127 and 28, it says, be fruitful, thing to do, and multiply, and subdue and rule. Okay? Be my co-regent here on earth is what God is saying. Work with me. Rule with me. I'm inviting you into the process of ruling the cosmos the way I've put it in order. Men or even humans are given a place to be and a thing to do, right? And then on the 7th day, chapter 2, verse 1, very curious, the 7th day, God's done with his creative work and he rests. And oftentimes rest in this context, how is it portrayed? It's portrayed as ceasing work, right? And sort of resting, not doing anything so that you can recuperate, right? That's kind of how it's portrayed. But what's perplexing about that? I mean, let's be honest. What's God doing resting? Isn't God all powerful? Is he really tired? Does he need a break? And I think theologically we have to land on no, it's not a need of God. So you've got different people trying to land in different places why he might be resting in that way. I think we can get some help here from extra biblical sources. And by extra biblical, I mean outside the Bible. When we go into ancient literature, there are other stories of creation in extra biblical literature that involve pagan gods. There's never just one God. That's how this story is dramatically different. And when we get into these extra biblical stories, you've got competing gods. They have some similarities to the biblical story, interestingly enough. Not surprisingly, though, because they came out of a similar culture. So it's going to be stated in a way that the culture understands what's being said, but it's going to be dramatically different, the biblical account, in other ways. When we go into extra biblical literature, stories of creation accounts with pagan gods, in these secular accounts, the pagan gods, when they rest, at the end, they rest as well, which is very interesting. So it suggests to us that we can go maybe to there and find a better definition or an idea of how it was viewed in that culture in that time. What it means is they would enter the temple and they would take command. And that is what is described when it says they rested. They would enter into their abode that they had created. They just created the cosmos, and they would enter into a temple that they had built, and they would rule. They would take command. And so the way it's described in those settings, at the end of these epics, the idea of rest is not disengagement from the cares and worries and tasks of life, like lying in a hammock. That's the way we would define it. It's not an idea of disengagement. In fact, rest is what results when a crisis has been resolved. Okay, in this case, the solving of the chaos of the cosmos. When a crisis has been resolved or when stability has been achieved, it allows for the day-to-day routines to be established. And when we're talking about pagan gods, what we see is this means that the day-to-day operations of the cosmos can now be overseen the way they're going to be overseen. The function and order had been set up, and so now they can rule. Okay, we might use similar language of our ruler in the White House. Okay, no matter who that is at any given time. when his cabinet is set up, when the people are in place, when the rules of the country are in place, he can then move into the White House, and from the Oval Office, he rules, right? That could be referred to as rest in this context, in this understanding. Now, why is that important? Well, one scholar has said more recently that we should think of this idea of rest as it's a matter of engagement without obstacles than disengagement without responsibilities. Let me say that again, because I think this is going to be key moving forward. The way we should probably be understanding rest in the end of the creation account in Genesis is more a matter of engagement without obstacles than disengagement without responsibilities. When it says God rested on day 7, he's not taken a day off, he's actually engaging now that the chaos has been solved. Why is that important? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that Adam and Eve were at rest with God in the garden. We go into chapter 2. Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden, and it says in 2:15 to cultivate and to keep it. They were given a thing to do under the ordered, it's not chaos in the garden, it's an ordered structure, way of doing things, and God gave them, and they were doing their job, and they were at rest with God because they were functioning the way they were intended to function, right? But that's not the end of the story, right? What happened? They started working outside their order and their function. They ate of a tree that they weren't supposed to. They went outside the function and order, and biblically speaking, what that means is they left their rest. They entered into a state of unrest when they did that. And how does that portrayed in Genesis? What's their penalty? They're taken out of Eden, which is the place where God rules. It's the temple-like structure. I mean, lots of people have expanded upon that, that Eden is to be viewed as a temple where God rules. Adam and Eve are removed from the temple. Notice that Eden still stays intact. There's 2 guards at the entry so they can't get back in. Theologically speaking, Eden is still there. It's still functioning. God is still ruling. He is still resting. But humankind is now outside God's rest. And it's interesting the way it's described. The penalty given to Adam. It's in pain that you will eat of the ground. It's often translated toil, but the word in the Hebrew there is the exact same word for what Eve will experience in childbirth, pain. It's the exact same word. Eve, you're going to have pain in what you do. Be fruitful and multiply, right? That's your role. But now, outside of rest, that's going to be pain and toil. Man, you're to tend the garden, and now you're going to do that under your own efforts, not under the rest, right? You will have pain and toil in that. And so man will work, but it will be qualitatively different. It will not be restful. No longer will man be functioning where he is meant to be or doing exactly what he was meant to do in the way he was meant to do it. And I would just propose to you that if this is the correct way to understand this idea of rest, this is the same situation that we find ourselves in today outside of Eden, right? Under our own power sometimes, trying to do things that we were made to do, but doing them outside the way God would have us do them. And if that's true, then when we are in that place of doing it under our own power, we are in a state of unrest. And what God is inviting us back to is a place of rest, which means what? Well, from a function and order standpoint, what God's calling us to is back to a place where we are functioning under the order that God originally had planned for us, in doing the things, the functions that God originally had us to do with the gifting that He's given us. And when we are able to do that, we find rest. But Adam and Eve, they tried to work their own plan. And what they found was a place of unrest. And that's where the story of creation kind of leaves us. We go on into the descendants of Adam and Eve and the problems that ensued because of their choice and what happens outside the garden. And it's a good platform to begin our study, to begin the discussion on what is rest. And I think we've misunderstood what rest is, because I don't know about you, I've got some hammocks out on the place where we live, and I love getting them out in the summer, and I love just laying there. But the problem is when you get out of the hammock, what happens? No matter how rested you are, it just starts right, I'm tired again, right? I'm tired again. There's got to be something more. It's got to be something more than a set of rules, things not to do, the cul-de-sac that we find ourselves in, the conversation that we find ourselves in. There's a bigger labyrinth of rest. It begins right here. And what we're going to do next, in our next session, is we're going to begin to look at, now that Adam and Eve are outside that place of rest, how is it that God communicates with His creation that isn't at rest and reminds them that there is a place of rest? How is it that He does that? We're going to take a look at the entirety of the Old Testament in our next sections.